Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Rafe Kelley. Rafe, apart from being the founder of Evolve Move Play, is also someone many will be familiar with through many conversations here in the kind of liminal web metamodern discourse space. Rafe talks a lot with John Vervaeke and other folks, Greg Enriquez, I think, and a number of folks in this whole scene, just doing incredible work around. We'll talk about that, but briefly summarized around movement and embodied action and that sort of a thing, and particularly in the context of the meaning crisis. But we're going to be talking about a number of things that are adjacent, relevant, to that, but maybe in a slightly different way than usual. And before I get into setting all that up, Rafe, thank you so much for joining me. It's really a pleasure to finally be able to sit down and have a conversation with you. And just appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, likewise, Brennan. And you've been on my radar as well. And it's always nice to meet people who are just kind of thinking deeply about all the problems that occupy this little space of the
Yeah,
internet.
yeah,
Just, I don't know, it's fundamentally a really interesting thing, and it's fun to meet the others.
yeah, exactly. Well, and again, yeah, you've been a very prominent voice in that space and doing awesome work on your own front. I mean, again, I assume a lot of folks will be familiar with your work. So I won't. And as I was also suggesting, I think this conversation is going to be a little orthogonal in some ways to that, because what kind of got this conversation going, the spur for it was some conversations around metamodern Christianity, and I think you chimed in a comment thread or something somewhere in one of these groups or something, and I thought, oh, that would be a really interesting thing to explore, and you were up for it. Yeah, I thought it would be really interesting and meaningful to dive into that and to hear some of your story with that, and also how it's coming up in the spaces that you're operating in. Yeah, I don't know. Set that up a little bit if you would. Where you're coming to this at, or anything else. You can also feel free to, provide a little bit more context for the general work that you do. But yeah, feel free to set this up however you'd like.
Let's see. Um, yeah, I mean, fundamentally, my work starts within the world of movement and, skill-based practices like parkour and martial arts. And there's this recognition at some point that there's a character transformation capacity within that. And what should that be aimed at? What people are coming back to these things when they're long past their capacity to perform at a super high level. They say it changes their life. They say it changes who they are in some positive way. Well, what are they wanting to change, right? Or what are they wanting
Mm,
to achieve out of it? And is that the right thing to be oriented towards in practice, as opposed to just the skills of a specific practice? And within the martial arts tradition, you have the idea of martial arts as a do or a Tao, a way, versus as a jitsu, a set of techniques. And kind of realizing in my early 30s that I was really very much more interested in sort of how parkour could grow into a path towards wisdom cultivation,
mm,
than how it could be integrated with a broader set of practices. Because if we accept the idea that parkour is an engine of character transformation, the question is it actually the tool that we want at a given time or that we need to achieve the kind of goals? And then, of course, you have to ask the question, like, what kind of character do you want to become? Who are you trying to be? So you start getting into deep philosophical stuff. What is the good? What is the true? What is the beautiful, right? Um, and so I've been wrestling with those questions, I guess, for uh, definitely over a decade now. And in that, I encountered Jordan Peterson. He had a huge impact on my thinking, and that was sort of the beginning of really starting to wrestle with the role of Christianity. I think there was probably some of that beforehand, because I've always been deeply interested in evolutionary biology and anthropology.
mm,
You start like really looking at broad historical context and anthropology, you see that there's some really unique things about Christian civilizations that are worth trying to understand, and that it doesn't seem like we as a culture really have grappled with in the secular sort of sphere.
yeah.
Um, and then I encountered John, and it's interesting because I don't think I've ever heard Jordan talk about agape.
Mm,
But Jordan talks so much about logos, about this idea that our orientation towards truth, um, where truth is conceptualized more broadly than like scientific fact. And what is that truth that we're oriented towards, and how do we orient our life towards that? And this kind of heroic journey, which very much has to do with like what we do in parkour. And then encountering John was really when I encountered the idea of agape, and that had a huge influence on me. And
And so people know you mean John Vervaeke, specific, yeah.
Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, and then John and I, of course, became friends, and we collaborated a bit. And he helps me a lot. And so I've kind of found myself in interesting conversations with Paul Vanderklay and Jordan Hall and Greg Enriquez and Jim Rutt, and in all that, I've been slowly, seemingly potentially converting to Christianity. I had a conversation with John and Jordan where I think it's eunomia is the term, or maybe I'm forgetting the term, but
For what? Why? I'd have to like. I'm thinking, is it eudaimonia or eumonia? I'm not sure.
I can't remember the term. But they were basically like using this Greek term to say, "Hey, you're in the middle of a conversion," and I was
Oh,
like,
metanoia.
Metanoia,
Yeah.
yeah. And I was like, well, okay, maybe I'm exploring. I'm exploring, and uh, this year I had a series of pretty intense interpersonal things that had happened over the last year that led to a place where I felt a really strong conversion moment.
Hmm.
And yet I still haven't kind of settled into a church community and a specific theology. I have I'm definitely still in the searching mode. And there's a kind of like if we take like an internal family systems thing, I've got like my little rational man who looks at things one way, and I have this spiritual calling that looks at things in a different way, and they're not entirely integrated as of yet, but I'm
Yeah.
working
Well,
on it.
let's back up a little bit, because I think, contextualizing all this within your broader life story is really important. I think one of the things that's really fascinating right now is that, and especially in this space, people coming to an interest in Christianity are not the sort of folks who, when I was a kid, were the sort of people that you'd hear expressing, interest or desire to commit to Christianity. I grew up, in a very traditional conservative context and focused on the family, and kind of very kind of conservative, traditional, evangelical discourse was the norm. And then we go through this moment where, there's the new atheists, and there's this whole kind of cultural movement that really wrestles with that. And in many ways, Christianity culturally becomes sort of these kinds of things are always so difficult, because I want to say marginalized, but obviously at the same time not. It's still the dominant kind of cultural frame for our society, which I'm sure we'll come back to talking about in a second. But to some degree, there was this sense of, if you're interested in doing this sort of a thing, it's probably coming from a non or even anti-intellectual stance, and you're probably coming out of this from some particular kind of, I don't know, familial context or cultural context, maybe in the Bible Belt or something, right? And so that was a lot of the discourse at the time. But then, as you say, more recently, both the people in the space and more broadly, largely influenced by folks like Jordan Peterson, the kinds of people talking about this stuff are very different. And there are people who are coming from secular backgrounds who have sort of found their way to an interest in Christianity, having grown up entirely in a secular context, or even a very rationalist, materialist context, and are now feeling some kind of pull to this religious tradition. And so, in that framework, your life story is kind of an interesting example of that. So let's talk a little bit about that. One of the things I'll just say about you that I find, was really fascinating to find out, because I was aware about your work and the stuff you were doing before I made this connection. But your father was son Ray Kelley, a pretty notable, renowned, beloved, natural builder, architect. I remember watching a couple of episodes, for example. I think it's the show called Building Off Grid on Discovery Channel, and I see this gnome-like jolly man building these like hobbit cob structures, and I'm just like, what an incredible human being. It was like goals. That's how I want to be in 20 or 30 years. So Sunray Kelly was sort of on my radar, and then you were on my radar, and then it's like, oh, Sunray Kelly, Rafe Kelley, never made that connection. And so anyway, with that context, it kind of brought this new way of kind of framing your life story of to be the scion of Sunray Kelly, but in a very, I would assume, secular, maybe more new age, kind of more, you might say, postmodern sort of meaning or spiritual milieu. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about that, or whatever you'd like to share about that, and how growing up in that context has, what does it mean to come from that place and then find your way to where you're at now?
Yeah. One of the really interesting things about sort of developing a curiosity for Christianity is um, how much I didn't like the Christianity of the childhood that I experienced.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like the association for a kid of, who kind of grows up on the West Coast in a educated household that's more secular, new age, um, with the Christian majority, Newt Gingrich, Rush Limbaugh, with Billy Graham, like it's not a positive thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? You really see those people kind of as the enemy. Like that would be the perspective I think I grew up with. And so it was really profound to kind of encounter Christianity and realize that that's actually maybe not the whole story, and maybe actually a pretty unique and weird historical moment in what Christianity was.
Hmm.
So I resonate with that, and I think that that time period is important to put into context, right? Like the the yeah, it's an interesting period of time because there is obviously Christianity is incredibly culturally dominant in America in the 1990s, and yet it's not dominant in our elite institutions.
Right.
In the and so there's this weird thing of Christians as maybe the most powerful part of society, and also feeling like a victimized minority,
Mm-hmm.
which that gets complicated. But in my particular context, I think it's useful to understand my dad's context too, because my dad's grandparents came from Poland, and they were Polish Catholic, and they were very strict Polish Catholic. And
Hmm.
his lineage on his mother's side are the Janicki family, which is the largest sort of landowning, logging, and engineering interest in Sketchuk County, where I grew up. And so there's this incredibly powerful family that we actually inherited the central homestead of.
Hmm.
But my grandma Wanda, she was beaten by her first husband, and she divorced him because of that, which was totally not okay with her father, the patriarch of this really powerful Polish Catholic family.
Hmm.
So my dad and his siblings were referred to as the bastards by
Hmm.
his grandfather Stan, right? And so I don't know, so he has a complicated relationship, right? He's a choir boy, and he's in the church, and he's kind of like, there's a whole culture of being a Janicki that he's part of, which is like everybody, all the boys in the Janicki family log, all the boys in the Janicki family wrestle, and they all play football. And my dad's the best wrestler and the best football player in his generation, right? He goes on to play collegiate football. And then the story is that he's a star architect student at Western Washington, despite having dyslexia and all these learning disabilities. He's this amazing football player, is the team MVP, linebacker, and then he's like a bomb the Reds conservative, like hard line, growing up with that kind of mentality. And then he gets high on LSD with a group of friends in a dairy field when he's 21, I think, and he comes back as the character that you met on
Wow. Wow.
the grid, Sunray Kelly. Like he takes up that name, and he's literally a different person. Like my aunt Paula says, like, there was the sun, there was the Ray who was before, and there was the Ray who was after.
Wow.
And he takes on all the ideas of the sort of new age counterculture, and but weirdly, there's always a love of Christ for him. His favorite saint is Saint Francis of Assisi. His favorite
Hmm.
movie is Brother Sun, Sister Moon.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just so happens, so my older brother is my half brother. My mom was pregnant with him from her previous marriage when she and my dad got together. And then she couldn't get pregnant for a long time, and she was really worried about it. So my dad, right around the time that my brother, my brother's name, by the way, is Kai Razus. So you give you sort of the
Yeah.
what my dad was, what my parents were into at the time. But when I was born, my dad was in the New Age Church of Christ. He was going to these guided meditations where he was like asking for guidance about what was happening with my mom getting pregnant. And he had this New Age Church of Christ ascended master that he was going to see named Sethru. And so uh, he got the message he was going to have a little blue-eyed boy, and it was going to be okay. And sure enough, I came along. And so my name is actually Michael Raphael, right? So I'm named after the archangel. So my dad
Hmm.
had that Christian thing that was part of him, but I never really experienced it. We didn't read the Bible when I was a kid. We read the first like book of mythology that was read to me as a child was the Bhagavad Gita.
Hmm.
Uh, so we were raised in that. Both my parents were yoga teachers. My dad traveled to India to hang out in ashrams, and they never really tried to push anything on us. We didn't actually do any sort of spiritual or religious practice as a family. But then I had a mentor starting when I was 8 years old who was involved in like neo-pagan Celtic stuff and a revival of local indigenous traditions here in the Northwest called the Red Cedar Circle. So between like 8 and 12, I was like sort of a practicing member of the Red Cedar Circle. I had a drum and I did the ceremonies and I did the winter bathing um, and I was kind of involved in that. Um, but then my older brother was like a hard atheist. He's 4 years
Hmm.
older. He was like walking around bad religion t-shirts and all that, and just like totally disdainful of the religious practice that I was doing. And so he, ultimately, for a variety of reasons, I was not going to stick around with what was happening in the Red Cedar Circle. And so, rational materialist atheism became the the easy default. And then
How did that land for your dad for both of you moving into like an atheist, rationalist, materialist mode? Was he kind of just cool with that, or was it sort of like, ah,
my dad was very narcissistic, so I don't know that he noticed. Um,
okay.
right? Like he was extremely self oriented,
Uh-huh.
and so a lot of things just sort of brushed past him.
Uh-huh.
I remember. Um, Tell me if I'm going off on too many stories
No,
here.
this is great. It's great.
But so I started teaching my retreats. So I was teaching parkour starting in 2006, and I started a parkour gym in Seattle in 2008, 2009. And then in 2013, I had basically I like to do parkour in nature, and I wanted to take people up to Bellingham, an hour and a half north of Seattle, and take them to my favorite spots that I learned when I lived in Bellingham, where there was these great cliffs to dive off and all the stuff you see in my videos. Um, and so I was like, well, we're going to just do an overnight camp. And I actually looked for a bunch of other options before I was like, what if we just like set up our camps in my dad's yard? And I kind of didn't want to go there. My dad grew marijuana. So there was like marijuana plants all over the place. And this was before marijuana was legal,
Hmm.
before it became legal. And I had like 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old students coming from the parkour community with me. And I was really, really not sure about it. But I eventually like did ask my dad, and he was fine with me just doing it for free. I settled on his land, and I took people there, and people were just blown away by the architecture. And I was like, I
Mm.
grew up, it's rain, it leaks, it's cold, it's drafty, it's inefficient, it requires constant repair. I was not super excited about it, but everybody who came was so overwhelmed by how beautiful the space was. So I started doing it year after year after year, and eventually my dad got kind of interested in it. It kind of grew more holistic and more less park oriented, more sort of general developmental over time. And my dad sort of saw what was happening, and he, being a yoga teacher, he had a certain interest in it. And he at one point he came to me and he told me that he'd had this download. That was what he said. He'd had this download about breath work. So he created this system called the infinite breath. You can find it on YouTube, and he wanted to teach this infinite breath to the group. Okay, sorry. I have to go back a second. At the first return to the source, we have a sauna, a wood-fired sauna that my dad built in the woods. And so we all go into the sauna. My dad likes to get the sauna incredibly hot. Like nobody else can tolerate how hot the sauna is. So we like start the sauna. We come out there. He's got it roaring. He's in there laying down, taking up half the sauna. The rest of us are squeezed in there. And he's just quiet while we're chatting. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he just starts screaming, "Stop being so small! You are the universe!" I've got all these students from Seattle who've never experienced this kind of counterculture. I'm like, wait, okay, super embarrassing. So he asked me to teach his infinite breath, and he's doing all this like breathing exercise. He kind of grabs this ball and you're swinging your arms around and getting really small and getting really big, and you're breathing, and it's kind of like pranayama with some other stuff going on. And then of course he does the "we are the universe" thing, right? I was like, oh, dude, I just can't do that, right? And he talks about how we're all spiritual beings having a physical experience. And I went up to him afterwards and I was like, "Dad, like I don't like, it's fine for you to teach this. I just don't want you to do that 'we are the universe' bit," right? Because what I'm teaching people is about how they're not spiritual beings having a physical experience, that mind and body are not extricable, right? That we have to treat the body as primary to our experience of being. And he's like, "I thought I taught you better than that." And I was like, "Dad, you didn't teach me anything." What are you talking about? And so we had a little joke about that. The fun thing about my dad was that he was actually very aware of his faults as a human being, and he was very open to criticism. So I could sort of make fun of him for not showing up very much as a dad. But yeah, that's a little bit about that story.
Wow. So yeah, and I think that gives then a taste for, the spiritual and cultural milieu that, you're coming from. And then I think then, yeah, to bring back in this element now of the interest around Christianity or some form of Christianity is really fascinating because of that. And yeah, so I mean, so how do you go from that sort of milieu, not just the kind of more new age thing, but then, as you say, moving into a kind of materialist framework, um, to now, as you just said a few minutes ago, like kind of having some kind of a conversion experience, or like what has that process been like for you? And I'd also, as part of that, I mean, I'd be really curious because for me, there was also a very important time in my life of coming to appreciate I'll say the primacy of the body, but I mean like the importance of the body, I guess you could say. And obviously, if for someone doing embodiment work and the kind of stuff that you do, that seems to be very essential. Um, but yeah, there's an interesting way that, at least in my own spiritual journey, finding the right relationship between body and spirit, you could say, has been a really crucial thing. And I do think that that's actually a really core element to like a metamodern spiritual framing, or metamodern Christianity of some kind, is doing something a bit different than how these things might have been conceived in more dualistic frames in the past, of like, body versus spirit sort of a thing. But yeah, without trying to, lead the interview, like what was sort of your process for going through this transformation between from that to where you're at now with this?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where to start, because it does feel important to sort of say, like, a big part of my adoption of sort of rational materialism is also because of the failures of the new age spirituality or hippie spirituality
Mm,
that I described. I was around lots of people who are actively practicing different spiritual traditions, right? Who were, doing a little bit of Hindu this or that, doing some Native American stuff, doing some that. My parents both went to the Landmark Forum at some point. They were, they read the Celestine Prophecy,
mm,
and for the most part, I just thought a lot of these people were full of shit, right? And what really irritated me was, yeah, a lot of it felt like bullshit, right? It
mm,
felt like self-fulfilling or like not self-fulfilling, but sort of like it was a lot of spiritual bypassing. Like a couple key moments will sort of give the flavor of what I was around. when I was 17, I was sitting in a sauna with a bunch of other kids who kind of grown up in the same community, but they had more adopted the values of the community. And I was at that point like um, really committed to sort of left-wing political causes, and particularly like the thing that I cared most about was the environment. And I was talking to them about like, hey, we need to be like actively involved in environmentalism. And they all just said like we're just going to vibrate to the next dimension. It's like
Mm,
we sort of attend to this spiritual aspect, like all of these earthly problems will disappear, and it's all just going to, we're going to go into the age of Aquarius.
yeah.
My dad was
Yeah.
still talking about, the oncoming age of Aquarius, like to the day of his death. It's like, you guys have been doing this since the 60s and it hasn't worked. Like, when are you going to give up? When are you going to see? When are you going to reintegrate? Right? When are you going to take a step back and sort of metacognate about what this actually did? And then another one was, um, so my parents broke up when I was 12 because my dad cheated on my wife. Or sorry, not my wife, on my mom, and he had been flirting with other women for a long time. I don't know if that was actually the first time he cheated, but it was pretty dramatic and very uncool circumstance the way it happened. And so he moved just to the other side of the property, built a new house, lived there, and he would walk into our house and like just eat food. And so he was extremely neglectful to me in particular because I had the same learning disabilities that he had, and I think it was really hard for him to deal with
Mm,
pain that I experienced in school. He just wanted to take me out, and my mom was not willing to do that, and it created conflict. And he just sort of responded to that by sort of pushing me away emotionally, starting when I was 6. And so I was pretty pissed at my dad when I was in my teens, and I was very unapologetic about it. Right, I became a very sort of like uh, recalcitrant sort of person, where if you push me, I'm gonna take you apart verbally. And so at some point, I was ragging on my dad, and he was like, he said this a lot, but there was one particular moment where he said this where that really struck home for me. He said, "You create your own reality," right? And that the idea I got out of that was that my dad was basically believed that everybody else who was upset with him was creating a reality in which he was the bad
mm,
guy.
mm,
It's like, no, you created the reality where you neglected your children and where you slept with someone who wasn't your wife, right? Like, that's the reality you created. You alienated and destroyed these relationships by breaking the fundamental trust in them.
mm,
That's how you create your own reality. It's not because you
mm,
just choose to experience things differently, right? And so I saw so much of that spiritual bypassing. There was a ton of sexual misconduct throughout the communities that I grew up around, and I just got sick of it, right? And so I think growing up in the milieu, I like really just wanted to find something that felt solid that I could stand
mm,
on.
mhm,
When I started to really understand science and scientific epistemology at some level, I just adopted that as like, that's the thing. And of course, if you are in a materialist scientific worldview, um, it doesn't feel like there's much room for spirituality, and particularly, given the political divides that were kind of current during that time, it was
mhm,
like Christianity is the enemy, right? The moral majority who's trying to, prevent gay marriage and keep you from having weed. I didn't like weed, right? I don't have anything, but it was just like there was so much. Um, that was just the culture I was around. Was
mhm,
like, and then yeah, so I was, and then, it's the early 2000s. If you're on a web forum, it's like you've got the Christians arguing for new Earth creationism versus the atheists, and you got Think Origins and all that stuff, and I was just part of that, for that period of time, and I didn't really get into Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and all those guys deeply, but I was familiar
yeah.
with all of their work and kind of involved in that and having those fights with my friends. So that's kind of where I was until you know, till around the time that I discovered Jordan, and it
Huh.
was already shifting. But I remember really clearly, like after watching Maps of Meaning, it just put a ton of stuff together that was already gestating for me.
Uh-huh.
And when the biblical lectures came out, like I told my wife, like, I think I might be a Christian at the end of this, you
Hmm.
know, and I wasn't. I was much more curious.
Yeah.
Wasn't. And then I read Dominion by Tom Holland, and and like I said, like the anthropological reading, um, like you start. It's so funny how, people on the kind of current left, they view the West and Christianity as like uniquely evil.
Mm.
And and I think when you start really reading history deeply
Yeah.
and too deeply, you really get a different perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, yeah. So then that brings us to this really fascinating moment, which, has now some. It's not just this moment. It's it was given birth to by this, the past number of years, you could say, that have been leading up to this kind of, point where now this is a very viable option for people. It's a very attractive option for people in a way that it was not 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago. So there's something about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and then how that evolves. And then with, the sort of ancillary figures that come in the sort of wake of that, you could say, in some respects, like the Jonathan Pageaus and Paul Vanderklay, and this sort of like emerging online Christian sphere, this little corner, that sort of space. And and then to the point where now, notable folks in the space that we are, a part of, people like Jordan Hall converting, other prominent kind of intellectuals going this direction, and a number of people in the community that I talk to are also feeling that kind of that pull. Um, and and so, yeah, let's unpack all that a little bit. I mean, unpack it biographically, I suppose, because that's really what we've got to work with here. I mean, I've, done my own degree of unpacking it for, the things that are particularly salient and also concerning for me in a number of videos. So I won't get into all that. But unpack it for yourself, and then I'd love to ask some questions about it, right? But like, what was it about the things that Jordan Peterson was saying and on into his biblical lecture series? What was it about that turned a switch in your mind that made this somehow, by the end of that, you're like, hey, I could be a Christian having been what you were? How did that happen? What was it about that?
Um, I think there's like there's really kind of two modes that we have to play in between. And one is that there's a heart level attraction towards Christianity, which it's easy to go over to this other mode of like the justification and the rationality
Mm-hmm.
and sort of try to completely cover the heart attraction. And I don't know that I feel like there's a danger in that.
Sure.
So it's like I can give you my arguments for why I think Christianity is maybe good overall, or maybe more true, or more whatever that as they've occurred to me, and I'm not like deeply theologically an expert or anything, but it is what it's attracting me. But I feel like it's important to say, like, I think the emotion, they're mutually causal. It's not one or the other, but there's these weird places where the emotion sort of like precedes
Yeah.
the rational.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I'd be particularly interested in, because if it's just operating at sort of the propositional level, you know, I don't think that, yeah, then it's sort of, it dead ends there, I think. And so what I'm really interested in is precisely that emotional, embodied, phenomenological shift that seems to have gone on for many people, yourself included. And then it's like, is there a way of being able to track that in any meaningful way? And it doesn't have to be pegged to specific propositional claims, or it can be, but it doesn't. I would think, as you're saying, that it wouldn't be, that there's something about having gone through this experience, that there's something happening at the non-rational level. And I don't know if there's ways that you can put that still into words then to describe what that process was like.
Yeah. So I think where I want to start is first, there's a moment. I can't remember precisely when it is. I think it may be before I encounter Jordan, but I come across this phrase that, I'm not even sure that I have the exact phrasing right, but it's something like, "For God so loved the world that he sacrificed his only son that we may be free," right?
For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life.
There you go. So I had it garbled in my head, but somehow it just would start ringing in my head, right? It would be like, huh. And it does something inside me when that happens. And so there was this attraction to it. And then fundamentally, Jordan, if you read Maps of Meaning, he says there's two modes of construing the world. There's a mythological mode and there's a scientific mode, right? We can view the world as a form for actions, and we can view the world as a form for as a set of objects. So I'm a pretty competent scientific thinker from as far as I can tell. And I can play in that mode really well. And I had realized that like the questions that I wanted to answer weren't accessible in some sense, right? Or that the answers didn't seem to actually track, right? Like Jordan would talk about Darwinian truth as the outermost frame, but he's got two kids, right? It's like if you like really took on um, natural selection as a kind of moral compass, like the logical thing to do is to use every advantage you can to try to put as many genes into the world as possible. Like if you're just a gene replicating machine, like what are you doing? Because it doesn't seem like most people are actually trying to live in that. And I was like, well, what is the frame that they're actually trying to live within? And I was like, oh, try to live up to the good. Well, what is that from? Right? Like there's, like I used to think like ants don't care about Adolf Hitler, right? And if there was an Adolf Hitler of the ants, we wouldn't care either, right? Like
I'm just
even if
picturing a little ant with like a little mustache. Sorry, it's just a very, but yeah.
it's like we can always adopt a perspective that makes insignificant the things that are relevant and significant to us,
Sure.
right? Um,
Well,
and so it didn't feel like there was a way out of that
yeah,
within science. And then these archetypal stories as sort of measured out, and then sort of connecting that to pragmatism, connecting that to ecological psychology, understanding phenomenology, and how we actually don't encounter the world first as scientific thinkers. We encounter the world with an inherent phenomenology, and this completely changes sort of how you encounter these ideas, right? Just the idea that the book, the story of Genesis is not a invalidated scientific theory of the world. It's a representation of eternal patterns of being, changes things dramatically. And then you can compare it to the Norse mythos and the Mesopotamian mythos and the Celtic mythos. And you can say, well, actually, I think that the Genesis mythos somehow does contain a way of being that is more aligned, that feels better, right? And if you can compare like Achilles as a hero, or Cuchulainn as a hero, or Sigurd as a hero, and then you compare those heroes to the heroes that arise within Christ, and then all the kind of post Christian heroes, Saint George and Roland and like King Arthur. Those heroes are much better exemplars to me of how I would like to be, right?
yeah. Well, on that, so a couple questions on that, and I'm trying to track too for my own experience with this, because for me it was also through the lens of myth of coming back, and for me, not Jordan Peterson, he was more secondary. It was Joseph Campbell who was the real primary. There was the way he was talking about myth seemed like, yeah, it really revalorized it in a way that was very powerful, while simultaneously being able to hold a kind of academic rigor, a kind of intellectual depth. And also, he was hip to Nietzsche, and that was an influence of his, and that was important for me. And there was something very yes saying about his way of approaching myth and all that. But broadly speaking, I'm trying to track with that like emotional shift, because I get very much this like, yeah, this kind of materialistic, reductionistic, brute fact orientation towards life is not enough to live a full, rich, meaningful existence through. It's really important, but it's not enough. And so then there is this shift into myth and into symbol and into the richness of, what I think of as really the whole aesthetic and psychological sphere. And then that opens up for me, though, it opened up Joseph Campbell and Jung, and then through all that, Jordan Peterson. But then, so like that much I very much track with. Then when it starts to get though specifically into the Christian mythos, that's where I become curious because you were just saying, there's specific heroes that maybe speak to you more than other figures. But this would be the question, I guess, is like, given your prior negative associations and experiences with Christianity, how come you think that didn't lead you to, say, navigate towards Buddhism? Where the Buddha is also a sage, heroic figure, and but doesn't have the trappings of all that stuff, that the baggage that would have come with a Christian context and upbringing and that sort of thing. Because that's part of the question for me, is that it's more than just a move into myth, which I get the move, but the move into specifically the Christian mythos as compared to others, that's a particular thing I think is worth probing. So why for you was that, and how do you think that you were able to overcome a lot of these negative biases and associations with the Christian tradition to actually being able to see, like, no, this is the mythos for me?
Yeah. So I think there's two elements to that. One is, I think that the kind of the embodiment perspective that was sort of emergent in me just through the practices of martial arts and parkour, it doesn't align with Buddhism, right? On a really level. And maybe it's also just my inherent character. But for me, Buddhism is as far as I can understand it, is a religion that teaches renunciation of the sensed world, the experienced world. And weirdly, I think Christianity has often gone in this direction too.
Mm-hmm.
But in the inherent mythos and really in the origin of it, it's actually a religion that teaches the primacy of incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
So the Buddha becomes enlightened and is able to escape the cycle of being, and he comes back and tries to save other people so they can do the same thing. Christ goes through torture and death and comes back from death so that we can escape death to live in the kingdom of heaven as embodied people, right? It's right here. This is where the kingdom of heaven is. And that just to me is fundamentally true and correct at like the most basic level.
Mm-hmm.
If you comprehend the human being as a kind of spirit that exists separate from the body, I think you've fundamentally mistaken the nature of being, and that will actually lead to suffering. So that's kind of my intellectual justification for it on one end. And really deep, like very deep in my whole way of being and whole way of approaching things, is this thing about the rejection of the spiritual perspective, the spiritual duality where the body is seen as unimportant, right? Because that's also part of like the scientific perspective, right? The scientific perspective, it tells us that the two worlds mythology is not, it doesn't work. So, so coming from that place, coming from wanting to ground in this world, coming from wanting to be away from all this new age spiritual bullshit where it's like, okay, you're enlightened, but you're still fucking kids. Like, fuck you, right? Sorry. That's my perspective, right? Like, I don't care if you're enlightened if you don't have ethics. And a lot of the people who I met who were the most ethical in my childhood and who had good families and had good marriages and were kind to their children were Christians who had, completely scientifically incoherent worldviews, but they actually treat people well.
So you said you had two things. Was that both of them? Because I don't want to interrupt.
Well, I got a little emotional and off. But the other one was a kind of having grown up around white people LARPing as yogis and LARPing as Indians and LARPing as neo-pagans. That's what it felt like to me.
Yeah.
I fundamentally was, I'm not sure that with my life experience, with the cultural grammar that I grew up with that I could actually even be a Buddhist.
Yeah.
I think like that Christianity is so intrinsic to the cultural DNA of the West that that we really, I think there's something interestingly disassociative about this idea of simply adopting another culture's spirituality.
Sure.
You'll hear people say a lot in the West that Buddhism is a philosophy and it's not a religion. And and I just think again, it's like read some anthropology. That's not how Buddhism
Yeah.
practiced in
Yeah.
the East. Right? It's like you can read some sutras and some ideas, and you can read the philosophy of Buddhism, and you can be like, oh, I'm a Buddhist. But like if you didn't grow up going through the rituals of Buddhism, worshiping the little mini gods of Buddhism, embedded in all the cultural context of Buddhism, I'm not actually sure that it's like you can truly fully adopt it. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you can't either. But it just oriented me more towards Christianity was this fundamental skepticism that I think in part comes out of just the experience that I had as a child of seeing lots of people trying to do this cultural grafting and seemingly failing to do so.
Yeah. No, that all resonates a lot, very well with me. I mean, on both fronts. In the sense, so on the incarnation front, which I totally agree with myself, like that is to me one of the most important ways to read the Christian tradition is as a sacralization of incarnality. And as you noted, and believe me, as I could go on and on at length about, there are deep trends as well in the Christian tradition that are profoundly ascetic, world, I should say, flesh denying, body denying, and all that. And that is endemic to, all the axial age religions in many ways. But there is also this thing there in the religious tradition. That is this beautiful celebration of matter. There's a wonderful thing in the Greek Orthodox tradition around, it came up in the context of the icon debates and everything. And I think it was John of Damascus saying, I don't worship matter, but, if the God of creation deemed that, matter was a good kind of, thing that he could inhabit, then, we can take something from that. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I resonate very deeply with that sense. Programming note, I do also want to note that for some, people coming from the different aspects of the Buddhist tradition, it is certainly also the case that Buddhism evolved other turnings, you could say, and you get into Vajrayana and Tantric Buddhism and things that are very, you could say, body affirming and incarnational in their own way. So those modes also do exist in the Buddhist tradition. But also to your point in that second issue, which I think is really interesting, which is like, yes, I went to Yale Divinity School and worked with Christian Wyman, and he used to talk about Christianity as his language, right? That he grew up speaking that language in the same way that he grew up speaking English. And so, in terms of trying to navigate spirituality, that's just the language he feels most at home in, and he can speak the most eloquently in, and therefore, and it doesn't need to preclude other languages, but there is something very deeply significant about coming out of the cultural fabric of a particular place, with particular traditions. And especially for people who want to feel rooted, which is a big aspect of people looking for meaning in religion, and there's also, that sense of feeling like a fish out of water, or this sort of playing at religion when you, kind of import something that feels exotic in some way. And there's also a danger and a fascination that comes along with that, because the exoticism can be partly what gives something an aura of sort of sacrality. Like I was starting to learn Sanskrit a couple years ago, and it's like, wow, how beautiful, how rich, and all this stuff, and reading the Bhagavad Gita and stuff. But there is this distance there that is sort of ultimately at a certain point in life insurmountable. And so there is a push then to try to root yourself in where you've come from. So anyway, I just wanted to say all that because I resonate with all that very deeply. I will say that, so then this gets me to two things. One, biographical. For me, given my experiences with Christianity, how do I say? I felt like that wasn't ultimately a place in any current manifestation or instantiation that could feel fully like a return home in a way that would work. So that probably contributed to me moving more in the direction of mythopoeia, of trying to, if you can't sort of like return to your home and you can't just sort of move away, maybe you try to build a new home for where you're at, and that's a different kind of way of being grounded. But the question I want to ask you though is, so given all that, sorry, by the way, you might hear my sheep buying in the distance.
Right.
So yeah. So
Very
given,
Christian.
yeah, yeah, very pastoral. So given I totally track with all of that, then the question for me becomes, where the propositional enters back in, because totally with this mythic orientation, trying to root yourself in the tradition you come from, all of that. But then when the question becomes, all right, so now we're ready to convert to a particular tradition, now you must affirm the following creedal statements that are actually saying specific things about what happened in space-time. That's where, for me, a lot of the cognitive dissonance starts to enter in. And I'm curious how that moment is something that you're navigating and how you relate to the propositional aspect of things like a bodily resurrection of Christ or other kinds of claims that are made in the Christian tradition that might then bear on, or let's say rub up against, or rub against, go against the grain of some of that more rational materialistic insight that you have also integrated. So yeah, how are you navigating that?
Um, Still navigating it, let's say. But one of the ideas I've played with is this idea of minimum viable miracles.
Okay, yeah, I like that.
Right? So to get your so Gödel's incompleteness theorem says, right, we have to treat as axiomatic some things that we're not going to be able to justify within our from our logical system. There's
Right.
always going to be axioms that have to be adopted before we can actually scaffold up our worldview. Right. As far as I can tell, current cosmology requires us to accept the miracle of the Big Bang. We literally cannot causally interpret or like think about what happens before the Big Bang. We just have to accept. Cosmology says, give us this one miracle, we'll explain the rest. Right. So that's a one miracle worldview. It's a one more miracle worldview that leaves us bereft of any normative frame. And when we dig deep into it, we end up at this place where we're like, but to get to that very clean, very systematic worldview in general, until we get to the depths of quantum physics, which is always weird to try to talk about because I think people really love to use quantum physics as a source of,
Mm.
let's call it bullshit armor.
Yeah.
Okay, but we have this weird probabilistic C at the root of reality that's not atomistic, actually, and isn't billiard balls, and we don't know what to do with that. But we have a really clean way of thinking about causality and epistemology within the scientific worldview. But how do we enter that as conscious beings who experience that world? And we don't seem to have a good system of that, right? Like Jordan Peterson talked about Newtonian truth versus Darwinian truth. Like the Newtonian clockwork universe, it doesn't really work to explain consciousness, and then we're left with the mind-body problem. So if you accept on some level that science is nested within some greater onto-epistemological, metaphysical space, right? So then it seems to me like it's possible, and I haven't run all the iterations through to make sure this is actually coherent, but this is the gestalt that I'm feeling towards, is something like accepting the bodily incarnation of Christ may be the necessary miracle that allows the whole metaphysical, ontological, epistemological system to actually stand. And it's like the idea that you get from Nietzsche and you get from Peterson and all that somehow science finds a way of seeing the truth that's actually rooted in the Christian orientation towards truth that then destabilizes the very truths of Christianity. But when we dig deep into science, we find that it can't justify itself, and then we end up saying, okay,
Yeah.
well, does this operating system even run without a deeper structure that's actually Christian?
Hmm. Yeah. So this is there's a lot to all this in my thinking. So a couple things, and I'm not sure where would be the best place to begin, but there's a part of me that is trying to make the case, I guess, in a metamodern Christianity, a framing in that sense, that maybe goes a different route, because you know again, permitting and allowing, celebrating, agreeing with all that stuff you were saying before around, we need to approach the world through a mythological lens. That's really essential for us. Science alone can't work. We should do that through our own kind of grounded cultural roots and the language that we speak and all that. I'm also then very comfortable to enter that space, but to hold it as that space and then not have to use the language of mythos to, try to account for the language of logos, you could say, right? Like, but I also understand that maybe people find that unfulfilling because it doesn't seem to shift them the worldview. Maybe people feel like, oh, well, now we're just giving a Christian glaze to kind of a still kind of scientific. And that's where the deeper insight to me that's become very profound comes in, which is that I would actually take issue with the notion that a Big Bang cosmology removes a normative aspect from reality. And so, a big thing for my work is seeing meaning in evolution, is seeing meaning in the complexifying cosmos that we're a part of, and to appreciate that, wow, over this 14 billion years, yeah, we did just, all start out as this kind of like, radiation. But look, wow, life emerges. Isn't that something? And then animals emerge and can feel and have experience. And then, wow, human beings emerge that have like intersubjective, morality and concern and ethical regard. And like, hey, there seems to be a deepening, a progressive unfolding of something really meaningful and valuable, deeply value laden to all of this. And I feel like that is a way of approaching all the same kind of basic architecture of, a contemporary scientific worldview, but by seeing the inherent teleological and axiological significance in it. And that's been the route that I've found the most productive, just because then you don't have to get into this issue of like, well, maybe we have to postulate, well, you said the incarnation, but even there, right? It's like, okay, well, now we're back to a two worlds mythology where something needs to come from outside to get incarnated into. And then what do we do with this whole resurrection bit? And then what do we do with all the miracles in the gospels? And then what do we do, and it seems to put a lot of strain on, that more kind of scientific foundation. And so I guess I just wanted to say both those points because for me, then it's sort of like, okay, what if we grant, this scientific frame, hold the mythic frame as something different, and then allow ourselves the ability to see both, to enter both, to move between both, to see one in terms of the other, that sort of a thing. Anyway, how does all that land for you?
Yeah, I find it quite interesting. There's a couple things that come up for me. One is like a move that I've wanted to, that I personally like when people push Jonathan Pageau or push Jordan Peterson on this. The move that I've often wanted to hear them make is something like, and I actually have seen Pageau more or less say this now, is something like within a scientific worldview, we cannot justify the incarnation, right? Like if we're going to try to argue that Christ died and like died and was resurrected, or the resurrection, I should say, we're never going to get there with science,
Right,
right? It's unparsable from a scientific perspective, right? Because we just don't have the tools that could allow us to apply science to that question,
right.
right? We can say with historical critical lens that Christ is almost certainly a real person,
Hmm.
right? And almost certainly something really strange happened that left an enormous impression on
Hmm.
a lot of, you know, like a lot of times people are like, well, these death and resurrection gods, they happen all the time, and all this stuff, but it's like not really like that. Not a historical person, you know. Alexander doesn't actually come back from the dead. Augustus doesn't come back from the dead. They're all considered, godlings on earth, but they don't come back from the dead. And then, when you're dealing with the post-Christian world, it's like, okay, that's a world where people are actively aping this myth now. They're trying to ape this myth. Um, so it's it's a problem both ways, right? Like if you if you if you accept it, then it puts into question a lot of things about the world, the scientific worldview. If you don't accept it, it's still one of the weirdest things that's ever happened in history, and you have to explain why this one rabbi from Judea, 2,000 years ago, has this incredibly massive influence on world history.
Yeah,
You know,
well, so yeah, I mean, again, like at the propositional level, none of this really hits home for me. Like that's the thing, and I don't know if that's a product of studying this in academia for too long or something, but for me, what is alive is the mythos, right? Where it breaks down is then again trying to use the language of mythos to then play the scientist game about like what actually happened. Like for example,
yeah.
um,
So I mean, I think that the correct scientific perspective is that we don't know what happened,
mm,
right? That we do not know and cannot know the truth of the claims of Christianity from a scientific perspective. And that if we take a skeptical scientific perspective, you would tend to say, no, that's highly unlikely, right?
well, like let me ask you a question though. Like, so part of the product of my classics degree was that I fell in love with Greco-Roman culture. It's hard not to when you know just study that stuff. But and Dionysus, right? Love Dionysus. Um, and Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, exuberance, drunkenness, all this stuff. Wonderful. And of course, then you get all the cultural overlays and interpretations and Nietzsche and Apollonian Dionysius, all this stuff. Just this rich mythological framework. um, Dionysus is real in that sense, right? We all know drunkenness and exuberance and licentiousness and all that stuff. It's real. But no one feels compelled to say, Dionysus really lived. He was born at this time, and isn't it amazing that he did all these miracles that are accounted to him, in these Greek legends?
Because
No one feels what's that?
it's not part of his story. He's not a historically attested figure.
Well, you could use
As
other.
a
Well,
living person.
so okay, another example might be the Buddha, right? There's a story of the Buddha, the day he is born, bursts out of his mother's womb, and he says, "In this lifetime, I shall achieve enlightenment." And there's a whole kind of hagiographical backstory of the Buddhas of the past looking down, and it's all very mythological, right? And like people can really appreciate that. They can appreciate it as mythos and be Buddhists even. And I would
Okay.
say people can appreciate the Christian narratives as mythos and giving us that rich tradition, but there's some specific aspect of the Christian tradition that seems to emphatically come down on this issue of no, but X and Y and Z must have really happened, as you said, minimally viable. It has to have been the case that this actually occurred for all this to work. And
Yeah.
that's the question I really want to probe a little bit. Like, can you conceive of a Christianity where it didn't happen, but one could still live in the religious language of their culture and find the mythic orientation to reality through that in a way that's still meaningful and valuable to you, or not?
I think that's where I'm searching, or I feel like if you really wanted to push someone to answer those questions and have a concrete answer, it'd be more like Peugeot or Jordan Hall. But for me, I don't really have like a clear place that I stand, right? I
Mhm.
don't know if I believe in the resurrection. I don't know, like I'm not sure exactly what it means to say that I believe in the resurrection, right? And I'm not sure what part of me I should prioritize. So let me tell you the most recent thing that happened. So,
Mm.
um, hmm, I told you I had a mentor when I started came into my life when I was 8 years old. So it was
Mhm.
a and it moved in next door. And at the time, I was struggling in school such that my mom had to take me out of school and homeschool me. And I was getting in fights. I hospitalized a kid, I think, when I was 7 years old. I was really struggling. And so I had this guy who came into my life, and he took over my education, right? And so it was like he started babysitting for my mom. He started like helping out cooking in our house. He did all this stuff for us. It was really healing. He started doing rough and tumble play with me, and so my dad, that was like my best way of connecting with my dad was wrestling. right? He used to throw me in the air, swing me around. He's an incredibly physically strong and powerful guy, and he's very playful. And I love that, right? I love that. And then when he couldn't sort of emotionally handle what was happening with me, and then he and my mom were in conflict all the time, he just sort of stopped. And so this man came into my life. His name was Gopal, and he started doing that stuff with me. And I started. He tells me that I started blacking out basically and attacking him, like not playfully, like physically doing everything that I could to attack. He would hold space for that, and we would just do that. And I'd call him the shadow. And I was just working through this rage at this shadow character that I had internalized, downstream of a lot of sexual abuse that I observed in my childhood. But when I was 12 years old, my mentor started sexually abusing me. And I always kind of thought that it didn't really have that much of an impact on me. Like I seemed to not, I wasn't depressed or angry or like worried about it. Like when I thought about it, it just didn't really have a lot of emotional coding for me. But as I kind of got into my later 20s, I started developing a lot of psychosomatic issues. So I started to have chronic fatigue. I started having irritable bowel syndrome. I started like really suffering from digestive issues. And I was just always looking for a fight, right? And so I went from like super left wing to super right wing, like borderline white nationalist by the time I was in my early 30s.
Mm.
And my wife came up in the same kind of secular left-wing household that I did. So like this transformation was really stressful on our relationship. And so it just created all these explosive, you know, angry fights between us where, I thought I was good. I never cursed at her. I never hit her. Never touched her, but she just felt this seething anger in me and it made her scared. She had a dad who was very angry and controlling and sort of, so she just naturally appeases, shuts down and shuts down emotionally. And so we were working through stuff. We were going to therapy and seemingly it's working, but every time that things get good enough, it's like another layer of how much she's actually scared would pop up. So at the beginning of 2023, she asked for a divorce. And I asked her to go back to therapy with me. We worked through things. Things seemed to be pretty good. But then we all went to Europe together and it was super stressful in the family. I was in the middle of teaching all my seminars. And then my dad had cancer and he was dying. So he came back from, so basically on the 4 days before our spring retreat last year, my dad's leg broke apart because he had a cancer lesion on his femur. And so I was the first person in the hospital with him and I sat with him and he was crying and he was scared. He knew that at that point that he was dying, he knew that he probably would never work again. And that was what was the most important thing for him in his life. And he kept apologizing to me. And I was like, you don't have to apologize. Like, that's why I'm here, right? So that you can have someone to feel these feelings with. And I walked away from that and I had this really deep realization that my dad was not sort of conditionally narcissistic. It wasn't that he was incapable of experiencing empathy. It was that something had happened to him that was so traumatic that he had cut himself off from his own negative emotions. Because of that, he couldn't empathize with negative emotions and he couldn't respond to them. He'd hear you. He'd admit that he was an asshole. And then he just couldn't do anything about it because he could never let it penetrate deeply enough to change his behavior. And I realized that that was happening between me and my wife too. I wasn't as bad as my dad, but there was this fundamental thing where it's like, I'm very rational. I'm very open to criticism. I'll hear out what she has to say, but I'm very slow to change in the ways that she needs me to change. And that's sending the signal to her all the time that her needs are not that important, right? So I go to Europe, I come back, my dad's lost 20 pounds in the 6 weeks I'm gone. He's getting eaten up by cancer. So every Sunday for 6 weeks, I go visit him. And I get his end of life stuff in order. I get my sister to come up from California and see him one last time. And then on the first day of Return to the Source, I go early before the event's going to start so that I can go get him to eat some food and to take his CBD gummies and to do some rehab exercises. And while he's doing his rehab exercises, a blood clot comes out of his leg and goes to his heart. And so he's doing some ankle exercise and he says, Rafe, I think that gave me a heart attack. And sure enough, yeah. So I call the ambulance, and they get him in it, and off he goes. And they're kind of like indicating it's a minor heart attack. And so I'm like, okay, he's okay. So I sit there, I cry for 20 minutes. I get up, I go teach my event. My brother sends me a message like 3 hours later and tells me that he coded and that he was gone for 45 minutes and that he's in the hospital. I have to um, come and be with him while he passes because he's going to pass that night. So he passes, and I go back and I teach my event for the next 7 days, and I come out of it. And up until this point, I've refused to ever touch psychedelics because what happened to my dad, I don't want to happen to me. I don't want to lose reality. I don't want to become Sun Rafe. But after it happens, I have this really strong call that I have to go do psilocybin. And my cousin Henry has been doing psilocybin with my dad in a very specific way for a long time. They take a tea, they do it in the sauna. And so I asked Henry to do this with me. So I go and I do this psilocybin journey. And I let go of all these shadows that I carried from my dad. And I had this really amazing experience. But between all of that, I'm still not able to really respond to what's happening with my wife. And I was invited to ARC. So I go out to ARC. And while I'm there, I meet a beautiful woman. And nothing happens, but it's distracting. I come back. I'm really like, I'm in the audience with this beautiful woman. And Jordan's talking about don't give in to your hedonic things, take up your responsibility, etc. And I'm crying, saying, like, I just want to love my wife well, just want to love her well. And I'm just repeating that in my head over and over again. And I come back, and she's like dyed her hair a bunch of colors, which is like for me is like a real signal of like the kind of the cultural strain that I don't like, and it just kicks off between us, and she can't, and it just shuts us off. So then, at the beginning of the year this year, she asked for a divorce again, and she's not willing to not have a divorce. She's not going back to therapy with me. It's over. So like there's a few days where I'm trying to negotiate with her, but it's like it's pretty clear what's happening at this stage. And so I have to tell my kids like I'm moving out of the house. So the day that I'm going to move out of the house, I have a chat with her, and just the emotions start coming up, and I'm laying there and I'm just weeping, like the most intense weeping that I've ever experienced in my entire life. And then it switches, and all of a sudden, it's all of this rage and all of this pain and all this realization of how much I've actually been carrying the rage around from the sexual abuse that I experienced as a child. And then in the wake of that, there's this point at which I'm laying there and raging at Gopal and raging at Ray, and I just have this intense moment where I'm like, I need there to be a father in heaven who loves me. I need to believe. And I started praying. I would just pray every day. And I didn't pray for my wife and I to get back together. All right. Just prayed that whatever happened, we did it in the most loving way that we could, and that we met each other's needs, and that we did the best that we could, and that we showed up for our kids and all those things, right? And then I just asked over and over again, thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will be done. And so I started praying the Lord's Prayer, and I started praying the Peace Prayer of St. Francis of Assisi and the Serenity Prayer. I would do that every night. And then I asked Christ to come in and show me that he was there and that he loved me. And I felt as if someone had pierced my hands with nails. And my whole body was shaking. And it was like the most intense experience that I'd had up until that point. And I went to my father's land, and I went out to this waterfall that we used to go to. And I sat there, and I said to Christ, like, if this is my cross, like I choose to accept it. I will take the pain so it doesn't have to pass down to my family. Like I'll process whatever needs to happen. So I went into 6 weeks of internal family systems therapy, 6 days a week. And then I did somatic therapy once a week. And at the end of that, I did an MDMA therapy session. And apparently it was the most intense experience of MDMA that the therapist had ever seen. Like I shook and screamed and cursed and like violently choked and ran for 4.5 hours. And then I came out of it for 2 hours, and I went back in for another hour and a half. And then I had 2 more 20-minute sessions that night, and then another hour and a half the next morning of tremors.
Wow.
And in that, whenever I would sort of like have this wave of tremors start. It would usually start in my hand, and I'd be like shaking like this, and then my whole body would start shaking, and then my hands would come up and I'd start screaming, no. And then as the intensity would come down, I'd just be like, fuck, or shit, shit, shit. But then I started saying, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. And then I started reciting, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me, right? Um, and yeah, so that was my moment, right?
Yeah.
Of, of, uh, of, of conversion, it felt like. But it was an interesting thing what happened, because I reached out to Paul van der Clay. I had a chat with Paul, and but I had really good help in the therapeutic world, right? Like I had the 6 weeks of internal family systems that I did was with a dear friend who's a former student of mine who did it at like a fraction of the cost of what it would normally cost. And so, all these people were showing up for me and helping me guide this through. And so interestingly, so 2 months after my first trip, I took a second MDMA therapy session. And in the middle of it, I was like, I don't know if I'm a Christian. I came back, and my wife saw like a complete change in me.
Hmm.
And the day that I came back from the second MDMA session, we were back together. And our relationship has been unlike anything we've ever experienced before. It's like completely transformed
Hmm.
how she relates to me. And it's been amazingly beautiful. But in the wake of that, I was so busy falling back in love with my wife that I didn't have any time to go to church or pray, right? And so now, in the moment that you encounter me, I literally just started praying again last week.
Hmm.
Um, and so I do, I, you know, so I'm, that's the emotional
Yeah.
place this is all
Wow.
kind of related to. So
Wow.
that's,
Yeah. I mean, gosh, thank you so much for sharing that. I want to say amen. Thank you for that testimony. I mean, that's incredible. And gosh, yeah, just to sit with that. I mean, that, you know, compared to these kinds of powerful experiences, you know, propositional theologizing is sort of like, okay, you know what I mean? I feel like that is something that a lot of people, I think, rightly recognize misses the point of a lot of the religious experience, of the conversion experience, of the Christian experience, uh, to try to reduce this down to a coherent system of statements or creeds or dogmas. And um, you know, when you have a dramatic experience of feeling your own hands being punctured by nails, and undergoing the kind of uh crucifixion experience almost, and going through that kind of processing, and the kind of profound, we didn't talk about this earlier, but actually I think it's really, really important, the profound way that I think also Christianity is unique in terms of forgiveness, as a mythos of forgiveness. Certainly in the Buddhist tradition, right, there's compassion, and that, you know, that's its own thing and very wonderful. But I don't think there's anywhere as fully articulated a kind of profound transcendent vision of sort of ultimate forgiveness, including self-forgiveness, other forgiveness, to enshrine that, sacralize that so much. Yeah, I think Christianity is unique in that sense. And um, I've had a number of folks in my life, some of them very dear to me, who've also undergone, very extreme forms of trauma, sexual abuse. And it was interesting because even though, for myself, I might think, well, I can't identify as a Christian. I would think this person needs Christ. This person needs that letting go of what has happened. This, person would benefit, would thrive again if they could be able to, basically say, I forgive them. And there's something miraculous that happens in a transformation into Christianity that can afford that in a way like nothing else. And so the power of that is, indubitably real. Um, Whatever else we want to make of the onto-epistemological, metaphysical, theological kind of statements. And so, anyway, those are just some initial reflections on all of that. Yeah, yeah, very. I mean, what do you make of that? Like having I want to say having undergone, but it sounds like, I mean, you're undergoing this. This is still very alive and current for you. So in this state, how do you feel? How do you assess the significance of trying to get clear about, did the resurrection really happen or not? Like, is that, do you feel like that misses a point, or does it become even more important? Like, do you know what I mean? How are you relating to the propositional aspect now when the participatory and the experiential, the phenomenological is so powerful? And, yeah.
Um, I spoke with Paul Vanderklay on my podcast once, and he inverted Pascal's wager. Um, so the Vanderklay wager, right? He said to me that he believed that if he lived his life as a Christian, that he will live the best life that he could possibly live. And that if it turns out at the end that there's nothing, that he will still have lived the best life that he could live.
Mm-hmm.
And that really hit home for me, right? And so when I was making love to my wife for the first time after we got back together, and she was asking me, like, how have you changed, right? Because, it wasn't like we snapped back together. What happened was that for the first 6 weeks we were separated, I lived outside of the house. And then because she's been the default parent for our child's upbringing, right? And that's been really hard on her because she's also a full-time worker at Google. And so she had originally wanted to move out to an apartment. So I said, okay, this isn't working. Like, you're still really stressed. Like, how about you move out to the apartment? I'll take over in the house. I'm going to show you that, that I can run this household so that don't feel like you have to carry everything. So I moved back into the house. And when I moved back into the house, we have basically a couch and a love seat facing uh, a bookshelf with a TV in it, sort of the center of our house. So when she was there, I would come over every day from 3 to 8 and to be with the kids, except for twice a week. And then when and then the night was always weird, like me leaving was always uncomfortable. And we wouldn't talk at night. We'd just say goodbye, maybe have a hug or whatever. So when I moved in, I would strategically, she would go say goodnight to the kids, and I would turn the chair so that it was facing the couch. So if she sat down and wanted to talk, she could talk. And so she would sit down with me and she would start, she would usually say, we don't have much, I don't think there's that much to talk about tonight, but maybe we'll talk about the kids' logistics or whatever. And she'd start talking, and then I just sit with her, and then usually some stuff would start to unfold, and she'd just sit with me and talk about how scared she'd been in a relationship and how much it was related to the fear that she'd had in her childhood and all these things. And all these little pieces of her started to come out. It was really like internal family system stuff really worked in this context where I would see her grimace and I would know that it was a part of her that wanted to speak that was inhibited. And I would ask for it to speak. And even if it wanted to say something really angry and cruel to me, I would tell her, it's welcome with me, right? I know that it's just this part of you, and I want you to know that you're safe. And then I would thank that part of her for speaking when it came up. So we did this for weeks, for 2 months, and I never got angry with her really, except for maybe a couple times in that whole time. And I just sat with her and did that. And so she saw this change that had happened in me and this ability to meet her where she was emotionally. And she asked me afterwards, how it felt like I could be so cruel to her in the past, and then I could show up for her like this now. And I was like, well, it started with Jordan Peterson. It started with his sort of call towards responsibility and his framing of the hero's journey as this broader metagame. And I could take then what I learned from parkour and start branching it up into a metagame of character development. And then with John, I had learned to I learned to place agape at the highest. And that's why I'm a Christian, is because agape is the most important principle to be oriented towards in life, as far as I can tell. And the example of Christ's mythos orients us towards us better than anything else, as far as I can tell. And so that deep exploration of Christianity led me to this place where I could show up for her, and I could say, this is who I am and who I aspire to be, and it's the depth of me, in some sense, because it's Christ moving within me, right? And it's me reaching towards that Christ archetype. And there's no other culture hero that I could reach to that could ground the way of being that is healing for the people around me the way that Christ does. And so I don't like, I don't want to sacrifice the scientific worldview, right? Like I've had a couple of very long chats with Jonathan Pageau where I've really pushed him on this of like, how do we, like, all this symbolic meaning is great, and I get the phenomenology of how we have to show up in a mythic worldview. We have to stand within a mythic worldview. We can't actually stand within science. But how do you do that without destroying science? Because we can talk right now on this. And if we place science, if we place our mythos at the top in the wrong way, then we end up in a place where we're going to shut down science when it conflicts with the mythos. Like, I love Jonathan, but I see elements of that in his thinking, right? Like I see him, being like, of course the Jews, escaped during Exodus. And I'm like, but the archaeology says that never happened, right? Like, how do we?
Well, this is, I mean, gosh, this is it. This is the question that I feel like is so important, and the implications kind of how we go through this, how we navigate this, are really big, right? As you say, I mean, like, it is in this, it's not, well, yeah, there's almost something architectural about it in terms of like, if you put the foundation on the roof of a house, it's not going to go well, right? You want that proper relationality. You want the thing to be in harmony and to be optimally, oriented. You want the optimal grip, on reality. And so how do you do that? How do you properly prioritize these different modalities in their places? And I am equally, like I share that concern profoundly. Maybe more than most talking about these topics, and maybe I come across then as tending to overly harp too much on this point because I think it's so crucial. But I do think deep down that it can be done. I mean, we're trying to orient ourselves to reality, and reality is there. What you are experiencing and what you have experienced is real. So is science, and these things, therefore, have a synthesis. They have a way of being brought together. And I think we need to get open and creative about how we are willing to think about these things. We also want to acknowledge all the pluralities for the ways that maybe things will work for some people and not others. But yeah, I mean, I was talking to someone recently, and I think it was Neil Thies, and we were talking about complexity and no self and all this stuff. And I used the example how, some people, when they find out that that when you put your hand to something and you touch it, it's the electrons repulsing the other electrons and the other thing. And so then people will say, I guess we never actually touch. And then they get all sad about this, right? And then, but the reality is, no, like that's what touch has always been. It's just now we have a different way of framing it, but it doesn't erase the fact of, of what this
experience that, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's an abstracted way of looking at reality that only arrives for us because we're able to have this phenomenological experience of consciousness.
True. And so, Matt Segal's always, emphasizing that point, and we need to be aware of that as well. So that but this is the thing, is like that abstract modeling is also true, as is our phenomenological experience of it. And I guess I want to be able to bring those into harmony with each other. So, right. So like, you mentioned, you used the language of the Christ archetype, and even just being able to frame things slightly differently in that term, using a term like that, is really powerful, right? Because it's able to contextualize a profound experience like what you're having in terms that I think are still very real, right? Like there is a real archetype, and if you live according to it, you are going to live better and you are going to have healthier relationships and this sort of a thing. And then we are forced to maybe reconsider how we were conceptualizing the reality of these things before. Maybe we have more adequate ways to conceive of these things, and maybe older ways of trying to, you say, oh, did this happen in the past the same way that Pearl Harbor happened? Maybe that's not the right way of considering the reality of this stuff. And I think at their best, folks like Peugeot and Vanderklay are trying to gesture to that, right? And when I talked to Paul Vanderklay, we danced for a while kind of around each other around this issue of the real, like what is real, right? But my thing is that there's multiple ways of what we mean by the real, and we need to be sensitive to that. And if we conflate certain ways of reality with each other, then we can lead to a lot of confusion, and that's not helpful. But like, for me, at least, going back to Jordan Peterson for an example, there's an interesting move that, I guess, shift that's occurred, I think, in his arc, where early Peterson landed very powerfully for me in all the ways that you're describing as well. But I feel like that's different now when, recently in talking to Alex O'Connor, he's basically like, well, yeah, if you put a Panasonic video camera in front of the tomb, you would see someone step out. And then that to me seems to be the culmination of a shift in his thinking over some period of time that's moved further and further away from the kind of deep psychological, archetypal, symbolic ways of thinking into something more literal, more historical, more propositional. That's like, I don't know if that's the move that we need to do. And if we don't need to do it, and we can still affirm these deep kinds of experiences, these powerful life-changing experiences, and the reality of Christ, the archetype, the tradition, the symbols, these deep realities, if we can do all that without having to conflate those with certain kinds of ways of things being real, then I think we could have that synthesis. We could have the structure in harmony. We could have the proper ways of knowing situated relative to each other. And I think that would give us the optimal grip on all of this. How does that land for you?
I think I'm in a similar but slightly different place.
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying is something like, and I think this is sort of where Peterson might have been, which is sort of something like, I don't know. To me, this correct scientific answer is we don't know.
Yeah.
Probably not. Right. But I think that the right way to frame that is something like, if we consider this as a scientific problem, the logically correct way to answer that question is to say, we can't know if that camera would have caught Christ stepping out. If we could have, if we ran like all of our best sort of epistemological verification, justification systems on it, the scientific perspective would indicate that we don't have the ability to do that, one. And two, given what we know about how the world operates, it's highly unlikely. So you could say, I can see it from this scientific perspective. And I can also see that scientific perspective is nested within a broader logical experience and an ontological experience that to me indicates that the right place for me to stand is to assume that it actually did happen.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I can see that being a move that is a viable one. I guess for me, your story that you were just relating is such a powerful example of this, right? And maybe I'm misconstruing, or maybe I'm overlaying this in a way that is alien to your own experience. But it just seems like, what you have experienced and are experiencing, like you can't, like that's a given. That's the given. You start with that and you're like, this has happened, right? Now, how we understand that and the ways that we understand those kinds of experiences, then that seems to open up into a terrain of interpretation possibilities. There's multiple ways of making sense of it. But in terms of like the real transformation that you're describing, that's the data. So I'm of the mind that like when we work with that as our like, that's the basis from which, I guess what I would say is that if I were to find myself in a position feeling called to identify as Christian, as a Christian, and make that commitment, make that identity change, it would need to come from a place like that. Um,
Yeah.
and then, right, like the ways that we make sense of that can be multifold. And some people, it will be very important that this ties back into some kinds of reality that are very comparable to historical reality. For other people, it's like totally mystery. It's like, I have no idea how this happened. All I know is that when I oriented this way and I started praying and I started saying Christ instead of shit, 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 things really changed, right? And it's like, okay, great. And then I actually find that maybe, really a very faithful attitude, right? You were saying earlier, you're like, yeah, other people might give me an answer with more certainty, but I'm in a place of uncertainty about this. And I'm like, great, that's like, isn't that the faithful stance, right? There's something also, I think we tend to denigrate, that openness, uncertainty, but I feel like there's a way of reading the idea of Christian faith as being in that sort of radical, like, I don't know how any of this is working, but when I set my compass this way, things go well, and powerful things happen, and I feel plugged into the essence of being. And so, I don't need to be the scientist to then orient that. And then the last thing I'll say is that then for me, something kind of disenchanting happens when people try to then come to that and say, well, let me tell you propositionally what's going on here, and overlay a kind of mythos that then unfortunately has to bump up against the scientific framework, where if it was just left, it wouldn't need to, right? And similarly, science does the same thing. I mean, I've had mystical and profound experiences that retroactively I've looked back and I've been like, well, let me deconstruct how that could have just been chance, or whatever. So there's a disenchantment that comes from both, I think, and I think they both come out of this propositional modernist sense of like, all right, let's account for this as facts. And I think it's just like, well, but then we're moving out of the mythos into a different frame. And again, all of this is stuff that in its own way, folks like Peterson, Pajot talk about, but then they do wind up kind of, in the end, kind of landing back in that fact place. And it's like, if we can be comfortable with the mythos as mythos, if we can be comfortable with this thing, and then still allow for a world of facts to exist, and you know what I mean, there's so many different ways that these things can hang together and work and give us, I think, an optimal grip that doesn't put us in jarring contradiction or contrast with the rest of what we know to be true, in a beautiful, open way. And those are just some of my reflections on these dynamics.
Yeah. So what I hear in that is this concern that if we try to formalize and concretize these experiences of the transcendent, we run the risk of one, invalidating science in a way that science not actually operate, and then we're like, doing all the Aristotelian circles, right?
Oh, the epicycles, the Ptolemaic epicycles.
Right?
Yeah.
Ptolemaic epicycles. We're going to end up having to do that in our relationship to science if we start sort of trying to do this. And I think that Pajot and I think Paul in particular really like sees this thing as a species of modernism. This urge of Christianity to like absolutely hone on that is modernism. And if you read Maps of Meaning, obviously like Jordan is really wrestling with how to recover kind of the ways of knowing that were intrinsic to the pre-scientific worldview that have been lost in the scientific worldview, without losing the science.
Yeah.
And I think that like, Jonathan has told me, or I've heard him say, right, like Jordan has called him on the phone and said, what if this was all real? What if Christ really did come back from the dead, right? Like that's an open question for him. And I think he may be leaning more towards it being real in a factual sense, was say 10 years ago. And I think there's all sorts of positional reasons why it may be a lot more comfortable for him to sit in that now. But I don't think that he's certain at all. It doesn't seem like he's certain.
Well, otherwise he wouldn't be wrestling with God.
He said, he said probably.
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
I remember correctly. Um, my so I was listening to Paul Anleitner
Mm.
talk about this, and he was talking about, like he's talking about this idea that you recognize there are many different narratives,
Hmm.
and then you choose to sit within a narrative anyways.
Hmm.
And I think that that idea seems to be sort of like what you're pointing at, which is this sense of like, how do we how do we allow the full power of these things while holding them as mythos instead of
Mm.
trying to
Yes.
turn them into scientific
Yeah.
claims?
Yeah.
And I think that I think Christianity may be difficult in some sense because I think that it might rely on a kind of paradoxical relationship there, that it
Mm.
doesn't, you don't get to have perfect congruence, right?
Yeah.
I think to me, the move is something like, I'm gonna consider science when I'm in a scientific mode,
Uh-huh.
and I can see the question from within the scientific mode, and I
Yeah.
can also recognize that the scientific mode is not the full way to
Yeah.
apprehend the.
Yeah.
If I adopt a wider mode, then I end up in a different place.
Yeah.
And that different place for me doesn't mean that I simply neglect or try to break how I'm thinking within the scientific mode
Yeah.
when I'm.
Yeah.
So I can say, like, my experience of having Christ come into me, right? Like, that could be just a feature of my own mind. It's an intrapsychic phenomenon, right? Like entities that you experience on ayahuasca might be an intrapsychic phenomenon. It could be a kind of universal archetype that we all
Hmm.
have access to, but that is just intrapsychic to all of us. It doesn't
Hmm.
actually have an existence that's external to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Or it could be a kind of collective intelligence that does exist somehow networked through all
Right.
of us. I'm egregore and have no sense of interiority, right? It might not be a thing, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's actually a thing. Maybe it's the thing. Maybe it's the thingiest thing that's also not, right? And it
Right.
gets weird when we start trying to think in those ways.
But that to me is what's really powerful though about like that's why I was bringing up that whole touch analogy earlier,
Yeah.
right? Is that like maybe when people first hear something like that, then it sounds like it's a reduction, like it's like, oh, it's just an intra psychic or inter psychic transpersonal collective archetype operating at multi-scale, it's like, oh, it's just that. Well, I guess it's not, this
But if you,
other.
yeah, let's just play with that for a
Yeah.
second. It's like, okay, so there's this representation of Christ in my head,
Hmm.
right? And maybe it's related to this representation in all these different heads. And
Hmm.
maybe, right, when one or two are gathered in my name, there I
Hmm.
am.
Yeah.
So Christ actually is a force that moves in the world
Yeah.
through the to take on the
Yeah.
Christ archetype,
Yeah.
right? Maybe that's actually the most profound thing that's happened in history.
I think that's a great way of approaching this. And that's what I mean, for me, that like, that like makes it more
Yeah. It's
mind-blowing, sublime.
yeah,
And then, I mean, and then that is the logos. It is the
yeah.
pattern. It is the word. And it's imprinted, transpersonally in this kind of imaginal collective space that we're able to access, by shifting our own mental orientation and our will, and and all of this is also then based on all the layerings of cultural, mm, what do you want to say, the millennia, the entire Christian tradition of building up the archetype of Christ, is also then implicit here. We can't just say, that this isn't historically or culturally or incarnationally separate. It's all part of this growing, developing, evolving thing that has emergent properties that, and to call that Christ to me is like, I'm very okay with that. Um, Before I go on, I mean, how does a conception of like, I mean, especially
So,
having experienced something like this phenomenologically, like, does that track or, yeah, what are your thoughts?
I mean, so the big move for me along these lines, came. So I think that if you listen to Sam Harris, like there's no room for agencies above the level of the individual.
Mm.
And that was sort of the worldview that I was in, and I was very anti-spiritual. And I was reading Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram. At the same time, I was reading The Chronicles of Narnia to my children, and a book
Mm.
called What the World Knows by John Young about bird languages.
Hmm.
And I was talking to John Revecki. This is beginning of 2019 or beginning of 2020, something like that. And I had this radical sense of like, oh, when you go into the woods and you hear the voice of the birds, you're not properly attuning to a singular bird. You're properly attuning to the behavior of the birds as an aggregate.
Hmm.
And that aggregate is actually all attuned to that aggregate itself, as well as everything else in that environment. And essentially, it's the same principle by which a neural net works, the same principle by which an ant colony works. And in some sense, that it's very real. It's a real collective
Yep.
intelligence that you can access.
Yeah.
Then Google is the same thing, right, in a different way, right?
Hmm.
There are collective intelligences that we access. And so that gave a meaning to spirit that was scientifically
Mm.
viable.
Hmm.
Then you get into the egregores and everyone's, kind of talking about that thing in this space. But once you like let yourself move into transcendent kind of
Yeah.
characters
Yeah.
that go up that high,
Yeah.
and you notice that all of a sudden, like human beings are very much subservient to these principles and
Yep.
these powers and principalities. It's like,
Yep.
right, you hear someone say, um, let's see, what's a good one? Build the wall, right? It's like you can predict a lot about the rest of them, of their beliefs by that one thing.
Right.
So
Well,
these,
as people say, memes have people, right? There is a sense in which people get sort of possessed almost. And no, I mean, this is the horizon. This is the cutting edge of spiritual, metamodern Christian spiritual thinking and theologizing. It's sort of like, wow, now that we have these understandings of emergence, complexity, aggregates, and these kinds of, yeah, collective intelligence. Those are themselves memes that didn't even exist really in a serious way 50 years ago. But when you have them, you're like, wow, what if we reinterpret a lot of what people were picking up on in the ancient world in some of these terms? And I think that can do a lot. It can do a lot at multiple levels. One is that it allows us to see that there is some real thing going on there. It wasn't just people having hallucinations and being totally off their gourd. They were tapping into something real. It also allows us, though, to appreciate where the limits were in their own understanding of what these things were, right? And so, yeah, maybe, Paul was talking about, dominions and principalities. We might talk about, these egregores and collective intelligences that are, framed in terms of emergence and these sorts of things. But there's similar phenomena. And I think that once we're able to then more correctly orient ourselves to the dynamics involved, we can also then see what are just category errors, right? Like this is why, but actually, I want to qualify this in a second, but this is why I would say, like, did the Exodus happen? And it all hinges on whether or not, 600,000 Jews left Egypt. And if that didn't happen, then everything falls apart. It's like, well, wait a second. Whether that happened historically or not doesn't necessarily have any impingement on the fact that there are these collective intelligences, let's just say.
sure.
But what I want to qualify that, though, is what if this? What if there's some kind of need for those collective intelligences to sort of get activated? I'm just going to use this is totally speculative, just out there language that I'm just, edge of thought. So whatever, take it for what it's worth. But like, in people need to almost affirm certain things about the memetic structure in order to support the scaffold of these kinds of intelligences, which is then like, if historically after 2000 years of building up the whole Christian metameme, a core part of that has been the mythos element of the Exodus, and then along come people saying, well, that didn't happen. Then it's
Yeah.
like, well, wait a second, we can't fully activate this metameme at this collective intelligence level unless we can somehow affirm this. And then you get the need for people to reaffirm it and find these ways. And this puts us in a position of having to simultaneously, affirm and disconfirm something as being true, or rather to be able to say, at the level of historical science, no, but at the level of activating a collective intelligence, which is in a sense more real than just some historical science
Yeah.
stuff, it is. And that's a very interesting orientation to this stuff. And so those are the kinds of orientations that excite me, because
Yeah.
they help resolve and harmonize these things in exciting ways.
This feels very metamodern from what I understand.
Yeah.
Um, the okay, so that idea that there's a metameme or an egregore and that the capacity. Well, this was a question that came up for me earlier. It was like, okay, I had this experience of Christ, and it
Hmm.
was incredibly powerful and really, really like transformational in the
Yeah.
most important aspects of my life. It's like I think that part of my orientation would be something like I want to adopt and offer a worldview that makes that more accessible to
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Success,
Yeah.
right? The ability to believe in Christ in some profound way
Yeah.
is actually like maybe like a really, really necessary and valuable thing.
Yeah.
Um, and then you could say that like if I cannot believe in the resurrection, it may make it harder for me to
Right.
access
Right. Right.
this thing, right? Um, and you know, like, is it more important to me to get the specifics of evolutionary psychology right, or to adopt this mode of being that can
Yeah.
transform me such that I can that I
Totally.
can that I have
Well, but here's
like
here's a layer to that though, right? The fact that you're able to language that puts it changes everything because it changes the context. It means that that exists in your conscious awareness. So now this also becomes dangerous, right? Because memes also, and I'm just using that term memes, but we could use different language, collective intelligence, principalities, whatever. Right? These things, in a sense, need a certain kind of uncritical naivete to fully operate, right? As soon as someone becomes aware of the fact when they say build the wall that they're possessed by a meme, they're probably going to be less likely to, act in that way. But maybe similarly, I talked briefly to Jared Morningstar about this same topic. It's like, to what degree, I've always thought of this in terms of the veil. We seem to require some kind of veil to fully participate in those things, that in a sense have to like turn off our critical engagement. And then we have to act as if. And then when we fully act as if, we're not acting as if anymore. We're acting as that is the way it is. But what's interesting though is that, again, I think there's a value in not losing touch with being able to say that that's what we're doing. And that's, I think, fundamentally what marks out this metamodern difference about all this. Because if you can't, then you're always in danger of getting swept away and totally taken over, potentially by corrosive memes, by memes that are out of touch with an
yeah.
optimal grip. And so as long as we can toggle back to, and this is what I'm doing, then we can get our mode on. We're taking, that sense of the lens that we're using, and we're not losing touch with the fact that it's a lens, so that we can continue to choose to operate from that lens, and we can continue to choose to calibrate what lens it is we're operating from. That's kind of how I think of it.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions that I wrestle with here is like, okay, if we treat the spiritual as real, it's incredibly powerful in certain ways, and
Mm-hmm.
also just a really dangerous bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't I think I was
And we've
I'm not,
both seen a lot of that, it sounds
yeah,
like. So, yeah.
yeah, it's like um I remember when I first read about the fact that like Tibetan monks have a major history of abusing little boys too.
Mm,
It's like, oh, this isn't a Christian problem. It's
mm,
a power structure problem.
mm-hmm.
And spiritual power is a type of power that matters, right?
Yeah.
And it's like the samurai were all abusing little boys too. And charismatic Christian churches, I think, have like there's something tremendously powerful about the music, right? Like one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite songs right now is Tyler Childers' song, The Way of the Triune God. Do you know that
Mm.
song?
No.
You hear that? Old times, screaming and shouting, go up, tell it on the mountain, faith too strong to be left down, way of the triune God. I don't need the pills you take just to feel the spirit moving. Brother, I ain't slept in days, all without the pills you're using, right? Um, Without the drugs you're using. And it's like, oh, that's a real thing, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
people make profound transformations. They like get rid of addictions
Yeah.
through,
Well, I
you
grew
know,
up in the Pentecostal church, and that was the validating aspect of those experiences. It was that transformation, that conversion experience, and it was accompanied by praying in tongues and dancing and being overcome, and yeah, that stuff, that's real
yeah.
stuff.
How many of the leaders of those churches are using it to take sexual advantage of young people,
Yeah. Right.
right? So so there is some kind of like hard encounter with reality that's really necessary, and some willingness to say, I'm going to let reality dictate my worldview,
Mm.
right? Um, and on the other hand, so it's like I want to be able to listen to Bart Ehrman and be
Hmm.
like, I'm gonna take this argument seriously, right?
Hmm.
I can enter this in the right mode where I can
Hmm.
treat this seriously and treat it on its scientific grounding. And what I find there, like, I'd like to be able to integrate it in some way and have something that's stable, maybe, or metastable,
Yeah.
uh, on top of that. But on the other hand, like, once I accept something like an egregore, right, it doesn't feel, and especially like if I accept something like Platonic realism, and I recognize, that the way we experience time isn't necessarily
Mm.
intrinsic to reality in the way that we think it is, then the idea that the most profound and virtuous sort of dynamical system of archetypes has some real reality, and that it
Hmm.
impacts reality in some profoundly unusual way in the
Hmm.
life of this one man from Nazareth
Mm.
isn't so hard for me to conceive.
Sure.
I can
Yeah.
treat that as a mystery,
Yeah.
and also say that having faith to it
Yeah.
uh, might be the best place to start
Yeah.
my my ontology.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, a couple things there is one is like we're here in the 21st century talking about these things, but if we grant that versions of these were existing 2000 years ago in first century Palestine, then it's like, yeah, that played out in those contexts too. So what we've been meaning by, you know, we want to avoid the danger, right, of discounting something and say, oh, well, we now know that, diseases aren't caused by demon possession, therefore this is all made up, right? I mean, there's an interesting level even at that level. What's that?
I think there are definitely diseases that are caused by demon possession.
Well, yeah. And then, all right. So then this becomes a really interesting, again, like way of what we mean by these things, right? Like, gosh, I've seen people with addictions that, there's something inside of them that is taking hold of them and destroying their life from within. And if we want to call that demon possession, right, then like, and then
Yeah.
maybe what people were experiencing in the past where they were seeing that, giving a certain language to things based on their worldview, we now have a different way of framing, but it doesn't mean that they're less real. It just means that they're real in a different way. But again, we want to avoid the elision, the conflation. We want to be able to say in what way they are real and all that stuff. But the other thing I wanted to say was that what was the other thing I was going to say? Um, well, it has to do with, the participation in these things, I guess, is that, we are also we are influenced by these memes. And again, choose what language you will. I'm just going to stick with memes, but I mean something like egregore, collective intelligence, transcendent, transpersonal dynamic systems, right? Of a memetic, kind of quality. Um, we also contribute to them, and we are in a process in which these are themselves unfolding through time. And that was what I really wanted to hit on, was that uh, this is also something that changes as we learn. And for me, this is a really key aspect of all of this, is that like we want to appreciate that things are still under construction, things are still moving, that you could say God is still at work in the world, God is still coming into being, and that as we participate in the world, we are the hands and feet of Christ. We are participating in the direction that Christianity moves in and goes in, and we are participating in the kinds of memes that either get carried forward or altered or what have you, developed. And so that to me is a really profound mystical spiritual practice of like, wow, it's not just that these things are going on and they affect us. It's that we also affect them, and
Mm.
we affect them in terms of how we come to understand them better. And I think that is really another kind of emphatic point that for me is really powerful, and marks out something metamodern about this, because it's like, uh, what a demon is and now is or was, this has changed depending on time, depending on learning, and what God is by the same token, right? And so that there's something profoundly important about this complex of ideas that we're talking about, in which we are participating in the construction of the meme that is God, you could say, right? What you were, you could say, possessed by, or what entered into you, that Christ archetype, right? Presumably that was based on thousands of years of millions and millions of people also co-constructing and participating in that archetype. And so we want to see ourselves, I think, as participants in this process. That also means that we are in the role, however small, in our own individual way, able to help shape and just contribute to it. I call this building the cathedral. Like, this is the cathedral that we're building. And that means that there's a divine service that I think people are in that are called to, I guess you could say. And I see that as being a profoundly meaningful thing. And when we talk about this worldview that people are living in today, of feeling like everything's meaningless, there is no value, we're all just atoms in the void and all this stuff, like, what if you shifted that whole perspective to see that actually you are in a position to be of service to the divine, by helping transform the world and the sort of memetic space of human culture, and make that realization of the Christ experience more accessible, more true, more insightful, and simultaneously know more about what that is and know more about that. And then in the process, know more about God, I think, and know more about the divine. And again, what is more meaningful than to gain gnosis about the divine? That is always what the spiritual journey has been about. Anyways, that's a set of ideas that, in my mind, are all related, but they're exciting.
No, I think I get it. And I'll just repeat back to you a little bit of, like, what came up for me. But I think the sort of rapture Christianity is really mistaken, right? I think that for me, the right way to treat the kingdom of heaven is as a kind of goal, which allows us to unfold towards it, right? And like, if we can move more and more towards the mode of being that Christ exemplifies, then the kingdom of heaven slowly unfolds.
Yeah.
And I actually don't think that there's an end point to that.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's the right way to think about it, because like, motivation systems aren't actually set up for that. Right.
Yeah.
Like, when I love the way that Lewis represents it in The Last Battle. Right. It's further on and further up. Or as Peterson says, heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better. Allowing the divine to have a sense of growth, right?
Yep.
Divine is itself an evolving thing. It's a very interesting place to stand, and definitely, more metamodern, I suppose. But that is sort of how I feel about it. It is something like, and the other thing that popped up for me in what you were saying was, the early followers of Christ did not call themselves Christians. They called themselves followers of the way. And the idea of way, for me, going back to jujitsu, can be a way.
Yeah.
Or parkour can be a way. The deal of the way is it's something that you proactively are going on. Right? You are saved, right? But you continue to wrestle with God. Like, that's why I think Peterson has such an attachment to that image of Jacob wrestling with God, because it's like, that's the right way to be in a relationship. And I think it's actually not just wrestling, it's wrestling and dancing, right? But reality is something that we wrestle with and we dance with and we play with. And it's an unfolding process that, when we accept that it is inherently good and we aim ourselves to be in service of the highest good that is potentially there, and it can unfold towards a kingdom of heaven that is always unfolding.
Yeah. Amen. And I mean, hey, what better terms than evolve, move, play, for the very essence of things. Man, we could go for another couple hours, but I feel like we should probably, I mean,
I have to do, unfortunately, but
yeah. This is
that is
awesome though. I mean, honestly, this is one of the best podcasts I think ever. So that on this podcast. So thank you. This has been incredible.
yeah,
I would love to continue this. There's so much
yeah,
more to
we can.
explore here. But yeah, there's a lot of alignment, and I I hear your journey and respect it, and wish you all the best as all these things continue to unfold for you. And yeah, I just let's just keep this open as a conversation channel, and I could imagine a number of ways of picking this up again and going in new directions. But
Yeah,
yeah,
let's do it. I think it'd be interesting to have you on my podcast to talk about what metamodernism is. It'd be good to just
yeah.
sort of go around and get some of your background as well, and then we could.
Well, maybe we make this a little bit of a series then. If I could go there, and John was always great about doing that. We kind of trade spaces and that sort of thing. So yeah, let's follow up on that, and I'd love to do that. So cool. Well, until then, my friend, hey, Godspeed, God bless, much appreciated. And we'll talk soon.
Good. Thank you.